Given its controversial policy choices, what do we know about the impact of Covid-19 on unemployment in Sweden? And what does this tell us about how we could cope better with the next pandemic? Pamela, hello, welcome.
Hello, Tim. Thanks for having me here.
Now, as you point out in your paper, the media originally called the COVID pandemic the great equalizer, but I mean, certainly in economic terms, it hasn't worked out that way, has it?
It hasn't. It hasn't in both economic terms and also in health terms. So in terms of health, this has been pointed out, for instance, by Joseph Stiglitz, so in previous work, where he has observed how actually, depending on whether or not you can, for instance, work from home, you were more or less exposed to the risk of infection, but also especially in poor countries and or in the United States where there is not equal access to health services. So underlying socioeconomic conditions impacted the probability that a given individual will be infected by COVID-19. Then economists started also to analyze the economic impacts of the crisis that was caused by the restrictions put in place to contain the pandemic, and they also observed that those who were already most vulnerable in the labor market, so those individuals that were already suffering more in the labor market, were more heavily impacted by the negative consequences of the pandemic, at least in terms of unemployment, job loss probabilities. Of course, we don't know much necessarily about how this translated into living standards at household level, because in many countries, especially in European welfare states, there are systems of transfers and protection, social and economic protection, that might have actually in part protected individuals in terms of living standards from these negative consequences, but also we don't know much in terms of long-term effects, because we know that even a short-term unemployment shock could have very important long-term consequences, and for those we need to wait, of course, and see what is going to happen.
And so you've looked at this unequal impact on work, on unemployment specifically. You talked about the vulnerable groups. Who are the vulnerable groups in a crisis like this?
Yeah, so in a more traditional economic crisis, you would expect a vulnerable group to be defined along gender lines. Men will be more exposed, typically, to an unemployment shock because they tend to be more concentrated in sectors such as construction and manufacturing that are more cyclical. Instead, at the onset of the pandemic, some economists have observed that actually this time it could be different, because the restrictions put in place by governments to contain the pandemic have affected especially the service sector, where women tend to be more concentrated. So women could be a vulnerable group. Another group that we tend to be worried about are young workers. This is because some companies might have these last in, first out policies, due to which basically once they make their firing decisions, the first to be gone are those workers that were hired more recently. And this could also depend on the type of contracts that young workers are in. They are more likely to be in temporary contracts, which are also the most likely to be terminated when a company needs to downsize. So we looked at these two groups, but also due to actually data availability, we also looked into foreign-born status, but this turned out to be particularly interesting in the context that we look at, which is Sweden, because foreign-born workers in Sweden are a particularly vulnerable group in terms of pre-pandemic outcomes. And since we know from previous work that the pandemic has not only exposed but also increased the existing economic inequalities, so then this was a group that definitely we wanted to look at, as much as say so-called unskilled workers, so workers with other papers have focused on levels of education. We have focused on their wage level, actually.
And of course, this is Sweden, which is famous for being a policy outlier during the pandemic, where the rest of Europe was closing down its public spaces, its schools, its restaurants, its bars. Sweden left them open. Were you also looking for the impact of those policies?
Absolutely. So we cannot study directly the impact of the policy, but we thought that it's interesting to look at the Swedish case and follow this group of workers in the Swedish context vis-a-vis other contexts that have been already studied, precisely because Sweden has this non-conventional sort of approach to the pandemic, a much more laissez-faire approach. There were not stay-at-home orders that would separate sectors of the economy into essential versus non-essential, and schools were never closed. So this was relatively peculiar, although of course there was a restriction in mobility because there were strong recommendations and some sorts of limitations. So then we wanted to see whether in a context where, which is pretty unique, at least among European countries, where there is this different policy approach, is it still the case that the pandemic exposes and increases the existing inequalities? And given that our focus was on inequality, we also thought that Sweden is especially interesting because this is a highly equal country along a number of dimensions. So income inequality in Sweden is relatively low as compared to other OECD countries, although it has been growing in the last decades. And also gender inequality is definitely lower than many other European countries. So again, we thought that looking at those groups that we discussed before, wage levels, women versus men, will be particularly interested in this context.
I was looking at the data that you have in your paper. It is so detailed, isn't it? Right down to that individual level. Where do you get data like that?
So the data are from the Swedish Employment Service Agency, which is basically responsible for administering Swedish labor market policies. And this agency, among other things, registers unemployed individuals. So any person who is unemployed will want to register themselves with this agency because this registration gives access to relatively generous unemployment benefits. So then we have the data on the number of individuals that each month register with this agency, and this information is disaggregated by occupation, and we have 400 occupations to look at, by gender, and then by other groups such as foreign status, foreign-born status, age group, etc. And we observe this data at monthly level for the months before and after the first wave of the pandemic in 2020, so from February to July. And then we also got access to the data for the year before, which allows us to make a comparison that would account for seasonal factors, so we can say something about potentially the causal impact really of the pandemic.
So two groups that, as you point out, traditionally are the losers in all of this, the young and the low-waged. Were they losers again this time?
Yeah, unfortunately they were. So the young, what we see in the data is that they are, so we basically, the workers are disaggregated in this data in 5 age categories. And we see that basically the younger the age, the higher is the probability that there was an increase in unemployment due to the pandemic. So defined, as I said before, as the change in unemployment risk before the month before the pandemic and the 5 months of the first wave, compared to what happened in 2019 to account for these seasonal factors. And another interesting thing that we see, so first of all, how do we explain this? There are 2 things that could play a role. One is that young workers are concentrated in occupations that were more heavily impacted by the pandemic. Think, for instance, of bartenders or waiters. These tend to be young, so that's why the young workers were more likely to lose their jobs. But since we have this occupation level information, we can also account for the occupation in which these individuals work, and we see that that explains only in part this difference in the extent to which the workers were negatively affected by the pandemic. So this means that the conditional on being in the same occupation, the young workers are the first one who were fired, probably due to these last in, first out policies that I was discussing before, or the fact that young people have less stable contracts, so they were the first to basically fall apart once everything was falling apart. And then the other category that we look at is, we say there are low-wage workers. So here we have wage level data, like average wage at occupation level, disaggregated even by gender. And then we can basically classify different occupations across wage deciles. And we see that there is this clear negative gradient, meaning that the lower the wage decile, the higher the increase in unemployment risk due to the pandemic. So now consider also that even before the pandemic, the low-wage workers were at higher risk of unemployment. So this means that an existing inequality has exacerbated. And this also, we also thought it was interesting to point out that if we were to do this analysis in percent point, meaning like what is the percent increase in the probability of unemployment, then we will get to the opposite conclusion, like the high-wage workers, relatively speaking, saw a larger increase in the risk of unemployment because they start from a very low risk of unemployment. But we thought that a better measure of actually how hardly you were hit is the percentage points in terms of unemployment, increase in unemployment risk.
A few weeks ago, Pamela, sitting in your seat was Francesca Caselli of the IMF, and she was talking about she sessions, as you point out, that in this pandemic, because of the nature of it, the fact that it would disproportionately affect women, certainly in the first wave, and that's what you've studied. Was there an evidence of a she session in Sweden?
Not really. Not really, which actually confirms our intuition going into this study that it was important to look into this aspect within the Swedish context. So we conduct this analysis in different levels. So first we do what many other studies have been doing, which is let's look at different sectors of the economy. We look at the share of women. Is it the case that more jobs were lost in sectors where there are more women? We see there that there is actually a positive coefficient, meaning yes, the higher the share of women employed, the more the sector, the more loss, the higher in our case the increase in unemployment risk in this sector. However, some of these sectors are very small also for the way we are defining them, their occupations. So then really what we want to know is, like, me as a woman and you as a man, if we compare each other, we are in the same, say we are in the same occupation. Is there any difference, or even in different occupation, is there any difference between us due to our gender in the probability that we lose our job during the pandemic? So once we conduct this analysis at individual level using our population level data, the answer is not really. No evidence of gender differences. If anything, once we consider the occupation we are in, we compare women and men in the same occupations, it seems that men might have been actually more negatively impacted by the pandemic. And the way we explain this is that there are some intersectionalities, like maybe the sectors that were more affected by the pandemic are also sectors where the women tend to be older than the men, given the other labor market dynamics. So there is this intersection between gender and age. We cannot look at this because we don't have data disaggregated by gender and age, but we think this could be a suggestion of what might have been going on.
And do you suspect that what's driving this is the pre-existing higher levels of gender equality that you have in Sweden?
So that could be one candidate explanation, meaning that in Sweden there is especially high level of female labor force participation, almost equal as men. Therefore, you will think there is a higher labor market attachment of women in Sweden as compared to other countries. So when a decision comes, who should potentially leave the job to stay home with the kids, for instance, the women do not have a differential, don't make a different decision as compared to men. But we think there is a way more important difference, which is the fact that Sweden actually did not close daycare facilities and schools below the age of 15. So really these decisions were not made within the families. They didn't have to readjust the time that they were spending in childcare to a large extent. So then maybe it's not surprising that we don't see this gender difference. And so there is that. Another thing that we think could play the role is also the particular extent to which there is sectoral segregation in the labor market in Sweden. So as I say, Sweden is a very gender equal country, but it has a very high level of sectoral segregation. So if you look, for instance, into the European Gender Equality Index, it does show you that in the last year, Sweden was the top performer in Europe across EU 27 countries in terms of overall gender equality, measured by an overall index that is made of several sub-indexes. Then if you look at the sub-index that measures sectoral segregation, you see that Sweden is actually below the EU 27 average. And this is because in Sweden there is a particularly high concentration of women in the health sector and in education and social services. Now, in our very disaggregated occupational level data, we also see that some occupation in the health sector, if anything, experience actually an increase in employment during the pandemic. And women are highly concentrated in these sectors with percentages that are above 70%. So in part, that could also have played a role. So the sectoral disaggregation, it's played actually in favor of women to a certain extent.
How did it work out for people who were born in a foreign country, Pamela?
It did not work out well. So as I said, and this confirms this idea that the most vulnerable groups are affected the most. So we know that in Sweden, migration is a recent phenomenon, relatively speaking, and we know that Sweden has struggled in integrating foreign workers in its labor market, especially foreign-born workers from non-EU countries. I'm not a Swedish national, but I'm a European Union national. If you look at the data, I fare relatively okay as compared to a Swedish-born person. But if I was born outside of the EU, I will start before the pandemic with a much higher probability of being in unemployment as compared to a Swedish-born citizen. And then during the pandemic, consider that on average, the probability of being unemployed for Swedish-born workers increased by 2 percentage points according to our measure. This increase was 2 times as large for foreign-born workers. And an interesting feature as compared to what we said before about young workers is that in this case, the segregation in different occupations doesn't play any role. So it's all about differences within occupations, meaning that we think foreign-born workers seem to be in different type of contracts, basically, as compared to Swedish workers. And our data do not allow to look into this, but we think it's going to be an important dimension, especially because these differences in pre-existing, pre-pandemic risk of unemployment between foreign-born and Swedish-born workers are especially large in Sweden, larger than many other European, actually OECD countries.
I had guessed, actually, Pamela, that you were not born in Sweden.
I'm so surprised to hear that.
Tell me, there are some other surveys like yours that have happened in other countries looking at the labour market impacts. So comparing those with what you found out, can we conclude anything about the impact of Sweden's policies compared to other COVID policies in other places?
Yeah, we can as I said, we don't look directly into the policy effect, but we can infer some overall implications, let's say, from what our data tell us in this respect. And I think there are two main takeaways. So one is that, as I said at the beginning, Sweden used a less, like a rather unique actually approach in terms of trying to contain the pandemic, mostly based on recommendations. Restaurants and bars were never closed. There were only restrictions on the time when alcohol could be served or where it could be served, for instance. Nevertheless, as in for the other countries, we do see that the pandemic exposed and increased existing inequalities. So having this different approach did not, qualitatively speaking, change dramatically the way the economic crisis actually played out in Sweden as compared to other countries. We don't do any quantitative comparison, so maybe the impact was on inequality was less strong, but we can't say anything about that. But qualitatively, no evidence that there was difference. But instead, as I was suggesting before already, it might be that instead the decision not to close schools was very important in terms of not increasing or not creating gender inequalities in terms of who had to basically quit their jobs, which is something probably that could be taken into account in terms of maybe looking into preparing for future pandemics or also preparing for other waves of the current pandemic.
Yes, I was just going to finish off with that, Pamela, because we can't take other countries and make them into Sweden. So is there anything that they can learn from the successes and the failures of policy in Sweden when it comes to the labour market?
Yeah, I think if there is one thing that I think it will be interesting to look more into, I don't want to give like conclusive, make conclusive statements because ours is one study. I think more studies should be put together to form an opinion about this. But I think our study is pointing at least in the direction of it will be worth to look more into the role of school closures during the pandemic on different outcomes. Because school closures can have the positive effect of containing the pandemic. We don't know how big was this effect. And for instance, Emily Oster has this big project where they're trying to look into this. This is a very important question because school closures also have negative effects for learning outcomes of students, something we don't look at, but we all assume must have played a role, and mental health, etc. And also for gender inequality, for the burden that women had to take during the pandemic. So our study, looking at the experience of Sweden, suggests that all these things should be put together to make a comprehensive evaluation of was it worth or not to close daycare facilities, considering both the health effects but then the socioeconomic impacts as well. And then I think also another general lesson, as you said, we cannot make other countries into Sweden, and also we cannot infer from other countries what will be happening in Sweden, what has been happening in Sweden, and vice versa. So I think our study is showing like these peculiarities of the Swedish labor market and how they were reflected in the impact of the pandemic confirm what other researchers have already observed, that we cannot just have one study about the US and then apply to other countries whatever we learned from one specific context. We need many more context-specific studies, both preparing for future pandemics, for other waves, but also when we think of recovery plans that are currently being discussed and implemented.
Well, considering the number of questions, how important they are, and the quality of the data that you've got, I think you've got a lot to keep you going for a while, haven't you, Pamela? Thank you very much for this, though.
Thank you, Tim.
The paper's called Unemployment Inequality in a Pandemic, Evidence from Sweden. And the authors are Pamela Campa, Jesper Reuner and Svante Stromberg. It's in COVID Economics 83. Well, COVID Economics 83 was the last in the series for the time being, but remember, you can always look up all the papers in issues 1 to 82 as well as COVID Economics 83. They're free, they're open access at cepr.org.